It's a pleasure to speak before you guys today. I'd like to thank the organizers of TEDxUniversityofPittsburgh and all of you again, as the mayor mentioned, for coming out and spending your time with us on the weekend. As you heard, I'm an intensivist, and there's some of you in the room, I think, that know what that means. That means I work in the ICU. We take care of critically ill patients that are often quite sick. They're near the end of life, and some of our patients survive and some don't. One of the things that we struggle with and are challenged with each day on our medical rounds is what's wrong with our patient? What's the diagnosis? And how can we find that quickly so we can promptly get treatment started? So we often see these challenging patients, and we talk about it with our residents and our students and trainees, and we're reflecting on how we're faced with these decisions about what the diagnosis is tens, almost hundreds of times a day. And we're trying to think outside of medicine, where else are we coming up with these issues of classification, deciding what patient goes in what bucket versus another? And my background is a biology major, and so we were starting to think about animals and organisms and how we might classify one animal versus another. And one of my really astute residents started talking about the platypus. That's why this word's on the slide. And it was sort of a little funny. We're in the ICU. He's talking about the platypus. I didn't know what was going on. It was a bit of an unusual situation. It made me reflect on what is a platypus. I mean, I really hadn't thought about it in a long time. So stay with me. So this is the platypus, in fact. This is a picture from National Geographic. You can find it on the web. There's some really fantastic and unique characteristics about this animal. So there's the duck bill. You can see the webbed feet. And there's some other things that are not shown in this picture. And it made me think about when I first heard about the platypus beyond just this Google search. And in fact, was this book. And so I don't know that many of you in the room are parents, but those that you are have heard of Richard Scarry and perhaps the story, The Rabbit and His Friends. And it's a fantastic tale about this little rabbit. He falls into a hole and comes across an egg. And inside that egg, there is a creature that's shown up in the upper right-hand corner. And the whole story is about the rabbit and his friends trying to figure out what the platypus is all about. And some of the quotes from this are as follows. He has a big beak, little webbed feet like duck. He has a tail and a fur coat like beaver, shy like squirrel, and he came out of that egg. Right? And what they're describing here in this children's story is some of what we are faced with even in the ICU, is that they didn't know where to put the platypus. Was it a bird? Was it a mammal? Or in fact, does it sit somewhere in between? My son tells me there's like poison darts on their back feet. I mean, there's some really unique things about the platypus. But what the taxonomists have said is that the platypus sits in what's called the zone of rarity. This is the space between birds and mammals where an ideal classification system finds very few animals, right? Ideally, we would find things about birds, things about mammals that separate them completely, but then, of course, the platypus is causing problems. Well, there were some medical philosophers and diagnosticians in the UK 50 years ago that started to think about this in the context of medicine, and that ideally, we would know how to identify disease from health with these classification sets. And the zone of rarity, that one that the platypus lives in, is quite large. Not a lot of patients fit in there. It's really big, and it makes it easy for us to identify disease versus health. Right? And there's some examples, some great examples in medicine. So Huntington's disease, also known as Huntington's chorea, is a neurologic disorder. I'll tell you about that for a moment. This is the ideal case. Right? So when you have a genetic mutation in a certain part of your genome, you have a neurologic disorder where you have dance-like movements and a number of other symptoms. It's very characteristic. And you either have those gene repeats or you don't. This is the perfect example of where the zone of rarity is very large, and there's not a lot of patients that are fit in between. But here's the problem. Huntington's disease is quite uncommon. I've never seen a patient. And in fact, the world we live in the ICU looks a lot like this, where the actual zone of rarity is huge. There's tons of patients in the middle. We don't know what's going on half the time, and we can't decide whether they have disease or whether they have health or something in between. And so we started to reflect on, well, where does this matter most? It's probably in the condition that kills most patients in the hospital. And that, of course, is sepsis. And this is where I spend all my time doing my research and my clinical work. So how many in the room have heard of sepsis, just by a show of hands? Okay, so that's more than I expected. There have been surveys who've shown that when you randomly call people, in Pittsburgh, you might come up with 5 or 10% that have heard of the word. So let's go with this. So a little by way of background, sepsis, this is the actual definition. It's a life-threatening condition when the body's response to infection injures its own tissues and organs. So let's say we have a bladder infection or maybe a chest infection in the lung. It's when the body responds to that with inflammation that it causes collateral damage. And things like the kidneys, the lung, the brain, they all suffer from this. And these patients have sepsis and sometimes even septic shock. So when we think about that conceptual model we talked about before, ideally we could identify infection, the organ damage, separately from health, and it'd be really straightforward. And then patients who have both, those are the ones who are septic. But in fact, you might expect this is the real picture, where it's really hard to tell whether the organ damage was pre-existing before the patient even came in the hospital, or whether it's new and related to the infection, and therefore sepsis. Well, why does this matter? Well, I submit to you that sepsis is everywhere. Okay, there are, if I go back, 2 million cases of sepsis a year in the United States, and this accounts for 5% of our healthcare budget. In the hospital, of all the patients who die in the hospital, 1 out of every 2 to 3 deaths can be linked back to sepsis. It is an incredible public health burden. Here's the second problem. We don't talk about it. So although many of you in the room have heard of the word, this is actually data from Google Trends, a great website you can go on and you can track how many people are looking up certain terms on Google. And so which one of these curves do you think is sepsis? Right, it's not the red one, it's blue. Because red is stroke, yellow is heart attack, and blue is when people are typing in sepsis or septic shock. So that may not be a problem until you look at the mortality from these conditions, and you realize that sepsis, the death or case fatality rate from patients with sepsis, exceeds that of stroke or heart attack. It's almost more than those two combined. I submit to you, perhaps we're looking up the wrong things on Google. Here's the second thing. In sepsis, time really matters. So the standard of care for septic patients involves early antibiotics, intravenous fluids, and there's data that shows for every 1 hour delay in patients in whom we don't treat with antibiotics, their odds of mortality goes up by 3 to 7%. So you can imagine that if it's really hard to make the diagnosis and we wait 3 or 4 hours or we don't get it right away, that patient's odds of death is increasing rapidly right before our eyes. Okay, so it'd be great if the diagnosis was easy, but unfortunately it's not. So 13 years ago, a group of experts got together, an international panel, that laid out the criteria for sepsis for doctors and nurses. And they came up with 21 different things we can look for. This is in a great table. And they said, well, if 1 or 2 of these things are present, your patient's likely to be septic. And so I was thinking about this, and my mom's a math professor, and she's like, well, Chris, that's really easy. It's one of those probability things where it's 21 choose 2. She started to make all these equations that look like this. And what it was is that if you have 21 variables or signs or symptoms of sepsis, and you need to find unique pairs of them, you can come up with 200 different combinations of ways to identify a septic patient using these criteria. I mean, that's like mind-blowing for the doctor who has to sit there and do this really quickly. Okay, so we've gone over that sepsis is everywhere. Generally, we don't talk about it. Time matters, and all of these signs and symptoms that are blended together lead us to what I call the platypus problem in this really important condition. Okay, so how are we going to move sepsis forward? Again, the theme of our TEDx talk today. Well, I submit to you we should use data. We need to make it easy, educate us all, including people in the lay public, not just doctors and nurses. And then if we can, we've got to try to get rid of this platypus problem. Okay, so this effort has been started now for a couple years. So these professional societies shown at the top and in this nice schematic, including myself and others, were part of a task force to try to get together to tackle this really important problem. The first step was the definition, and I told you that before, a life-threatening condition in which the body's response to infection damages organs. And that definition is nice, but we need criteria at the bedside that doctors and nurses can use to identify patients quickly. And so what we came up with and derived and validated and have recently shared is something called QSOFA. And so I'm going to tell you a little bit about that. So this stands for Quick Sepsis-Related Organ Failure Assessment. It's a big mouthful again, but it's much easier just to say QSOFA. And this was, remember we wanted to use data derived from 800,000 encounters in 170 hospitals, 2 countries, an international effort and huge collaboration. In fact, some people have described this as one of the largest clinical research studies in our field yet to date. And what QSOFA is the following: that among patients with suspected infection, the presence of altered mental status, elevated respiratory rate, or low blood pressure are signs that we can look for to identify the septic patient. Now you'll notice these are what we call vital signs. These are the things that are checked by doctors and nurses routinely in patients throughout the day, and there are no laboratory tests involved. What we've done is take that 21 choose 2 and make it a 3 choose 2. And if you run the math out, that comes up with only sort of 3 combinations of these features we might need to remember. Much easier and faster for us to do at the bedside. So how did this play out in terms of the analysis? Well, what I've shown here is part of an infographic. And we found that for patients with suspected infection, if they had 2 of these QSOFA features, right, that was about 25% of the whole group, 1 out of 4. But those 25% accounted for 75% of the deaths. And this is a Pareto principle, right? It's sort of a version of a power law where we can use these criteria to find the patients that perhaps are at greatest risk, who we need to intervene on right away. I'll have one more data slide. So on this graph, what we've taken is all the patients with infection and divided them up into 10 groups. That's on that x-axis. Where group 1, let's say, are folks like you. You're young, you're healthy, not a lot of medical problems. Whereas the patients in group 10, those are older patients, maybe they're on dialysis. They have some comorbid problems when they come to the hospital with their infection. And what we did, we compared the odds of death for if you had the sepsis criteria or you didn't. And you see that the red dots, which is the new simple criteria, QSOFA, tend to be as good or better than the older criteria for sepsis that was in that huge table with 21 signs or symptoms. And this is an exercise for those of you who like statistics in predictive validity. But generally, it shows that even for young or not young elders who have a lot of medical problems, QSOFA does actually pretty well in getting us to our answers. Okay, so the next part was educate. So this data was released in JAMA, Journal of American Medical Association. It's a really cool and informative slide for those of us that live in the world of medical research. We chose to publish this in a general medical journal, and it's been viewed by more than 700,000 people in just 6 weeks. This set the record at 48 hours for being the most viewed JAMA paper of all time. And it really speaks to the grassroots interest in sepsis and the fact that this condition confronts us every day in the hospital. You can see the tweets, right? Social media picked up on this, and JAMA released a whiteboard video that was looked at 2 million times on Facebook. So this is an example of what I would call traditional as well as non-traditional education of both the public as well as doctors and nurses on this very important condition and the new research. Okay, so another summary slide here. We used data. We tried to make it easy. We've talked about different ways to educate, but we're sort of left wondering about this platypus. Does this sort of new QSOFA thing, get rid of the platypus? Well, it would mean taking this picture, right, where we had the small zone of rarity with lots of patients in the middle that were really blended together and hard to figure out, and make it look more like this. And so I don't yet know the answer. I know QSOFA made it easy, but oftentimes we trade simple things that are quick and easy and low cost for accurate things that can do things with great specificity. And so I submit to you, this is a sort of a blood drop, that the future in recognizing sepsis quickly and promptly is more than just these simple vital signs, but it's going to take a collaboration for us to move forward, right? From funders like the NIH and other private foundations, it's going to take patients, doctors, nurses, researchers, and folks like you in the lay public to work together and collaborate to try to find accurate tests that may involve even samples of blood to identify these patients promptly. Right? Sepsis is common and deadly, and we all need to work together, and we can't afford to wait. Thank you for your attention.